Earth sent one medic to a warzone. The warzone ended by nightfall. The first thing Rennick Okoye noticed about the planet Vessa Prime was the smell, scorched resin and copper, like a welding shop built on top of a slaughterhouse. The second thing he noticed was the sound, a low, continuous thrum of artillery somewhere past the ridgeline, steady as a heartbeat, the kind of sound that stopped registering as sound and started registering as pressure behind the eyes. The third thing he noticed, standing at the bottom of the drop ramp with his boots sinking half an inch into churned mud, was that nobody on this entire muddy, smoking hillside had bothered to look up when the shuttle landed. He set his duffel down in the mud, rolled his shoulders until something popped, and looked at the triage tent he'd been assigned to. Canvas patched in 4 places, the patches themselves patched again. A generator coughing black smoke in irregular bursts, like it was clearing its throat before saying something it didn't want to say. Wounded stacked 2 deep along the tree line, wrapped in whatever their squadmates had on hand, cloth, wire. In one case, what looked like a strip of peeled bark lashed around a leg with a boot lace. Nobody had come to greet him. That was fine. Rennick wasn't used to being greeted. Back home, he'd been busted down from field surgeon to line medic after a review board decided he'd disobeyed a triage protocol during the Kessler evacuation. He had, technically, if you counted, ignoring a stop treatment order to keep working on a patient who wasn't supposed to make it as disobedience. The patient lived, walked out of that camp 11 days later on his own legs. The board didn't care about outcomes, only procedure, and Rennick had spent the 18 months since running IV lines in refugee camps and learning, slowly, to stop expecting thanks for any of it. So when the Alliance Council had asked Earth for any contribution, however small, and some undersecretary with what Rennick assumed was a very particular sense of humor had decided the small contribution would be one medic, alone, to the worst active front on Vessa Prime, Rennick hadn't been surprised he was the one they picked. He was cheap. He was expendable. He didn't have anyone left at home who'd make noise if he didn't come back. Not since his sister had stopped returning calls 2 deployments ago, and the personnel office knew it, because personnel offices always know exactly which names carry the least political weight. He was 41 years old. His hands shook slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep, a tremor he'd trained himself to work through years ago until it barely showed in his sutures anymore. His medkit was a scuffed metal case held shut with a bungee cord because the latch had broken outside Lagos, and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it, not when there were always more urgent things to fix. He looked, by any reasonable measure, like nothing. A tired man in a stained coverall, carrying a broken box, standing alone at the edge of somebody else's war. That was the point. Nobody sends a message with a medic. That was what humanity's answer amounted to, and everyone on the council chamber floor back on the homeworld's orbital station had understood the insult perfectly, even if nobody said it out loud. One medic. Not a warship, not a company of soldiers, not even a squad. One tired man with a bag of bandages, sent to a war zone that had already swallowed 4,000 professional soldiers whole. The Threnn officer who finally came to collect him stood 2.5 meters tall, plated in a natural chitin the color of old iron, with 4 eyes set in a ridged skull that never seemed to blink all at once. Always 1 or 2 watching while the others rested, so that looking at it felt less like meeting a gaze and more like being observed by a small committee that never adjourned. Its voice, when it spoke, came out flat and precise, every word given equal weight, no rise or fall to it at all. The cadence of something that had learned standard from a manual rather than from a childhood. "You are the human contribution," it said. It wasn't a question. Rennick Okoye, field medic. One human. The Threnn's mandibles clicked together, a gesture Rennick would later learn was the equivalent of a scornful exhale, the alien version of a man rubbing his temples. We requested aid from the human sphere. Our envoy specifically requested medical personnel, munitions technicians, or combat engineers. Any of the 3, in any number your government could spare. We received a single unarmed individual with a broken case, arriving on a transport too small to have carried anything else you might have sent instead. This is not aid. This is a courtesy so thin it borders on mockery. The latch is broken, I'm not. Rennick hefted the duffel back onto his shoulder. You want to argue with the undersecretary who sent me, I'll give you Ecom frequency. In the meantime, you've got about 60 people lying in that tree line who look like they haven't been looked at in hours. Where do you want the wounded staged? Something in the Threnn's 4 eyes did a slow circuit of him, top to bottom, the way you'd look at a broken tool someone insisted still worked, weighing whether it was worth the effort of throwing it away or simply ignoring until it failed on its own. Follow me, it said at last. You will not last the week. I have seen younger, stronger volunteers from allied worlds fail to last the week. I would prefer, purely as a matter of administrative convenience, that you did not die in my triage line and force me to file the paperwork twice. Its name, Rennick learned on the walk up toward the Ridge Command Post, was Vessa, and it commanded what was left of the Threnn 9th Column, 600 soldiers, down from 4,000 at the campaign's start, holding a stretch of high ground because that ground was the only thing standing between the Korvax war machine and a Threnn settlement of 11,000 civilians who had nowhere left to run. The settlement's name was Ilvara Hollow. Vessa said it once flatly, the way a person says the name of someone they've already started grieving. 6 months we have held this line, Vessa said as they climbed. 6 months, and we have lost more soldiers than the settlement holds civilians. Every relief force the Council sends arrives smaller than the last. You understand what it means that they sent us you. I understand it means somebody back home decided this war wasn't worth the political cost of real intervention, Rennick said. I don't work for that somebody. I work for whoever's bleeding in front of me. Point me at the tent. By his 3rd hour on the ridge, Rennick had already reset 2 dislocated limbs, packed a chest wound with the field kit's expiring hemostatic gauze, expiring 3 weeks ago, according to the label, though it still worked well enough, and talked a 19-year-old Threnn soldier named HFY through the fact that losing a foreleg wasn't a death sentence, whatever his culture's warrior caste told him about wholeness and worth. The kid had been sobbing when Rennick reached him, not from the pain, but from the shame of it, certain his caste would strip him of rank the moment he returned home missing a limb. Where I'm from, Rennick told him, working fast, hands steady despite the tremor, we've got soldiers who lost legs, arms, eyes, and went right back to doing the exact jobs they did before, because the job was never really about the limb. It was about what's between your ears and what's in your chest. You've still got both of those. Hold still, this next part's going to hurt. None of that impressed anyone watching. It was just the job, the same job he'd done in 100 other tents on 100 other bad days, and if there was a difference here, it was only that the patients were taller and had more eyes. What got their attention was the 4th hour, when the shelling walked closer than it had all day, and a support beam came down across 2 stretcher-bound patients who couldn't move themselves clear, and Rennick, 170 pounds of unremarkable human in a stained coverall, got a shoulder under the beam and held it while a Threnn medtech named Urabel dragged both patients clear one at a time, and did not let go until his own tendons screamed and his vision went white and sparking at the edges, and someone finally took the weight off him. He didn't say anything heroic. He didn't have breath to. He said, "Somebody get me water, I think I pulled something bad," and sat down hard in the mud, arm hanging wrong at the shoulder, and that was the whole of it. No speech, no triumphant music, just a tired man catching his breath while medics who'd assumed he'd break on day 1 quietly revised their estimate. Vessa watched from the command dugout with all 4 eyes open for once, which Rennick would later be told was rare enough that the other officers noticed it too. That evening, after his shoulder had been strapped and he'd forced down a ration bar that tasted faintly of machine oil, Rennick sat outside the triage tent cleaning instruments by lamplight when Urabel approached and sat, uninvited, on the crate beside him. She was smaller than most Threnn he'd seen, quicker in her movements, with a scar running the length of one mandible that she never explained and he never asked about. "You held the beam," she said. "Somebody had to. There were 6 of us closer than you. None of us moved fast enough. You are not stronger than we are. Threnn physiology exceeds human physiology in raw output by a considerable margin. This is documented. This is not opinion. And yet you moved first." Rennick shrugged, wincing at the pull in his shoulder. "Strength's not the same as willingness. You can be strong and still hesitate half a second wondering if it's really your job to move. I stopped wondering that a long time ago. Doesn't make me stronger, just makes me faster off the mark." Urabel considered that for a long moment, all the way through 2 artillery thuds in the distance that neither of them flinched at any more. "The Korvax say your kind is prey," she said finally. "Vhestor did not tell you that to be cruel. It is simply what the intercepted transmissions call you, prey things, soft-skinned. I did not understand it as anything but contempt until tonight. I think now it may also be fear, badly disguised." "Prey doesn't run toward collapsing beams," Rennick said, and went back to cleaning his instruments. The inciting moment came at dusk the following day, when a Korvax herald crossed the neutral ground under a truce banner and delivered, in the cold formal cadence of a species that did not bluff and rarely offered mercy of any kind, an ultimatum that made the entire ridge go quiet. "Your line is broken," the herald said, addressing Vhestor while 40 Threnn soldiers stood at their posts with weapons half-raised and nerves stretched thin as wire. "Command has reviewed your positions from orbit. Tomorrow we take the ridge whether you resist or not, and the settlement behind it falls within 2 further days. But there is another path, offered under the old law, which our commander still honors though he need not. The right of attrition, single combat, 1 champion from each side to first yield or death. If your champion wins, we withdraw from this valley for 1 full cycle, and your settlement lives untouched through the winter, unmolested, under witnessed oath. If our champion wins, your line surrenders without further bloodshed, and you evacuate what remains of your column unmolested in turn. It is a mercy we do not often extend, and my commander extends it only because your defense here has earned a measure of respect even among those who intend to end it. Choose swiftly. The offer does not stand past moonrise." Vhestor's champion, a decorated warcast soldier named Korvax, was 3 days dead from a shrapnel wound that had gone septic overnight because there hadn't been antibiotics enough to spare him. Rennick had tried, had fought for 6 hours to save him with what little the depleted supply crate still held, and had lost, and had said nothing about it since because there was nothing useful to say. The 9th column had no champion left. Its other candidates for the honor were wounded, or dead, or simply not the caliber of warrior the right demanded, and everyone in the command dugout knew it without anyone needing to say that either. Refusing the right meant the Korvax attacked at dawn with full force, against 600 exhausted defenders, and a settlement that could not possibly be evacuated in the 2 days the Herald had allowed, even if every transport on the continent had been diverted to the effort, which it had not, because no transports remained. There was no way to opt out that didn't end in 11,000 civilians dead within the week. Rennick was standing at the edge of the command dugout with a suture kit still in his hand, having come to report on supply counts, when he said, "I'll do it." The dugout went silent in the particular way. A room goes silent when someone has said something so absurd that arguing with it feels beneath the effort. The kind of silence that follows a joke nobody's sure was meant as one. "You," Vhestor said, each word deliberate, "are a medic." "Correct. You are unarmed, untrained in Korvax combat forms. You possess no natural armor, no claws, no plating. You weigh perhaps a third of what their champion will weigh. This is not a task for a medic human. This is a task for a warrior, and we have none left worthy of the name. I'm the only volunteer you've got, Rennick said. Unless somebody else here's hiding a war-cast soldier in their back pocket I haven't treated yet. You will die, Vhestor said, flatly, not as a threat but as a fact being stated for the official record. Then you're no worse off than you are right now, and you've lost nothing you weren't already going to lose. But if there's even a chance this buys the Hollow a winter, I'm not going to be the reason you didn't take it. Rennick looked past the commander to the herald, still waiting at the tree line, patient as a held breath, unbothered by time in the way only something that has never once lost a war of attrition can afford to be. Tell them humanity's champion is ready. The herald's flat gaze passed over Rennick's mud-streaked coveralls, his broken-latched medkit set down at his feet, his ordinary unarmored body standing there without so much as a raised hand, and something that might have been the Korvax equivalent of amusement moved behind its eyes, quick and cold. This is your champion, it said, not quite a question, not quite a statement either. Very well. Dawn at the marked stones. The right will be Hun. Ord, and its terms will bind both our peoples regardless of outcome. That night nobody slept much. Rennick spent the hours checking and rechecking supply crates that didn't need checking, because it kept his hands busy and his mind off what dawn would bring. Urabel found him again around midnight, and this time she didn't sit. She simply held out a strip of dried ration meat and watched him eat it, arms folded, all four eyes fixed on him with an intensity he was starting to recognize as her version of concern. You could still refuse, she said. The herald extended the offer to Vhestor's column. Vhestor could name no champion and simply refuse the right outright. It would only mean the attack comes at dawn instead of the 2 days beyond it. And then everybody dies tomorrow instead of maybe getting a winter, Rennick said around a mouthful of meat that tasted like salted leather. I've done the math already. You have too, or you wouldn't look like that. I have watched war-cast soldiers 3 times your size die on that ground, she said. I do not want to watch it happen to the only person on this ridge who has not once, in 4 days, treated a wound like it was someone else's problem to have. Rennick didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't try to give one. He finished the meat, checked his boots one more time and told her to get some sleep, which neither of them did. The Korvax champion was called Gurn Vaskel, and when he stepped onto the marked ground at dawn, 600 Threnn soldiers went quiet the way a crowd goes quiet before a car crash they can see coming and cannot stop. He stood nearly 3 meters, dense muscle wrapped in bone plating that had been grown, not forged, ridged along the forearms into something close to natural blades, dark and gleaming with the cold morning damp. Steam rose off his shoulders in the frigid air. Korvax ran hot. Rennick would come to understand fully only later. Hot enough that they never needed to sweat. Hot enough that heat itself had simply never once been a problem their biology had needed to solve, on a homeworld where the ambient temperature rarely dropped low enough to matter. This is your champion, Gurn said, in that same clip syntax the herald had used, no contractions, no warmth, no unnecessary words. A frail thing. I have killed younglings of my own kind with more meat on their bones than you carry, human. This is either an insult to the right or a jest in poor taste. Which is it? Neither, Rennick said. He was tightening the strap on his boot, not looking up. You want to get started or you want to keep talking? Because I've got wounded to get back to whenever this is done, one way or another. Gurn's mandibles flared, surprise, maybe, or something close to it, that this small, unarmored thing standing before him wasn't shaking, wasn't backing away, wasn't doing any of the things Gurn's long career had trained him to expect from something so plainly outmatched. You do not even carry a blade, he said. Didn't bring one. Rennick straightened up, rolling his bad shoulder once, testing it. Rules say weapons of choice. I choose none. That legal. The herald, standing witness at the edge of the stones with a data slate held ready to record the outcome, consulted some inner code Rennick couldn't see and said, flatly, it is legal, unorthodox, but legal and binding once invoked. Then let's go. The first beat of it was simple, brutal, and nearly fatal. Gurn closed the distance in a single bound that should have ended the fight in the first 3 seconds, faster than anything Rennick had braced himself for, and it very nearly did end there. Rennick took a glancing blow across the ribs that folded him sideways and put a crack through at least 2 bones he could feel grinding wet and wrong every time he pulled breath. He hit the dirt hard, rolled through it instead of away from it out of pure reflex, came up 8 feet clear with blood already soaking dark through his shirt and his ears ringing. "You concede?" Gurn asked, not moving to press the advantage, almost curious, the way a much larger animal might pause over prey that had, against expectation, gotten back up. "Give me a second." Rennick spat blood into the dirt, tasted copper, forced his breathing into something shallower and more controlled so the broken ribs wouldn't grind quite so badly. Just getting warmed up. That was beat 1, and it cost him 2 ribs and a rising, wheezing pain every time he pulled air, a pain that would not leave him for the rest of the day, and if he was honest with himself, for a good many weeks after. Beat 2 came 20 minutes later, when the sun had climbed enough to start baking the stones, and Rennick had spent that whole 20 minutes doing nothing but moving, circling, backing off, feinting toward openings he had no intention of taking, forcing Gurn to keep closing the gap over and over in armor that trapped body heat. Tea like a furnace with the damper shut. The Korvax didn't sweat. Couldn't. Their biology had never needed to shed heat that way, because on their homeworld nothing had ever asked their bodies to run hot and keep running hot while chasing something small and stubborn across open, sun-baked ground. Here, under Vessa Prime's climbing sun, Gurn's steam-wreathed shoulders had gone from smoking gently to pouring vapor in thick continuous streams, and his breath had started to come in shorter, harder pulls that Rennick recognized from a dozen field textbooks as the early signs of heat load a body has no mechanism to dump. Rennick, soaked through with sweat and bleeding from the ribs, was not tired yet. Not really. He'd spent 2 decades of his life running toward gunfire instead of away from it, humping 60 pounds of gear over broken ground in Chad and Sudan, and half a dozen places that never made the news, and his body had one thing going for it that Gurn's never would, not in 100 lifetimes of Korvax evolution. It knew how to cool itself down while it worked, sweat-wicking heat away in a slow, continuous exchange. His species had spent a few 100,000 years perfecting on hot African plains chasing prey that could outrun them in a sprint, but never in the long, grinding heat of noon. "You are stalling," Gurn said, and there was an edge in it now, something less than flat, something that might have been the first thread of frustration a species raised on quick, decisive violence had ever needed to feel. "I'm pacing," Rennick said. "There's a difference. You'll learn it the hard way if we're both still standing in an hour." Beat 3 came harder than either of them wanted. Gurn, growing impatient with a fight that refused to resolve itself the way every fight in his career had resolved itself, abandoned caution and drove forward in a series of strikes meant to end things regardless of the cost to himself. 3 blows, each one aimed to kill, each one just barely evaded or partially blocked, until the 4th caught Rennick across the outer thigh and opened a gash deep enough that he felt it hit muscle before he felt the pain of it. The way bad wounds always announce themselves a half-second late. He staggered, went down to one knee, blood running fast and dark down his leg into the dirt. This was the moment. He'd known it was coming, had planned for it the moment he'd seen the schematic understanding of Korvax joint plating in his own head the night before, lying awake running through everything he knew about their anatomy from 2 decades of cross-species field manuals nobody back home had ever expected a lone medic to actually need. The plating beneath a Korvax jaw, where the bone armor hadn't finished fusing until well into adulthood, was softer than anywhere else on the body. Not soft in any absolute sense, but softer relative to everywhere else. Gurn was built like a tank. Rennick let Gurn close that last half-step, let the wounded leg buy him the illusion of an easy finish, and drove the heel of his palm, wrapped tight around a fist-sized stone he'd palmed off the ground during the very first exchange, 4 minutes and a lifetime ago, up and into that softer plating with everything his cracked ribs and bleeding leg had left to give. It wasn't a killing blow. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to make a 3-meter furnace of a warrior, already cooking in his own armor under a sun his body had no answer for, stagger back gasping instead of pressing the finish he'd earned. Gurn staggered back gasping. Beat 4, nearly an hour into a fight that should by every reasonable measure have ended in the first 30 seconds. Gurn went down to one knee for the first time in front of 600 watching soldiers of both armies, chest heaving, steam no longer rising off him in a controlled column, but venting in ragged bursts like something in his internal cooling had begun to fail outright. Rennick, 3 ribs cracked now, one leg laid open and losing blood steadily through a hastily wrapped strip of his own shirt, both hands split and swollen from 2 separate block strikes he'd taken more of than he wanted to admit, sat down hard in the dirt 8 feet away and didn't move to finish it, because finishing it wasn't the point and never had been. "Why," Gurn said between breaths that scraped audibly, "do you not close the distance? I am weakened. Finish it, human, before I recover and this becomes worse for you than it already is." "Because I'm not trying to kill you," Rennick said. "I'm trying to end this before one of us has to, and I'd rather it be neither." "That is not how the right functions." "Then maybe the right's due for an update." Rennick pressed a hand hard against his ribs, breathing shallow. "You're not my enemy, Gurn. You're a soldier following orders same as every soldier I've ever patched up on either side of a line, back home or out here. I don't need you dead. I need this alley to stop burning long enough for 11,000 people to see another winter. You want to keep fighting until one of us can't get up, we can do that. I'll be here." Gurn said nothing to that, only knelt there in the dirt, chest heaving, steam pouring off him in the cold morning light, staring at this small unarmored thing that would not stop getting back up. The 5th beat wasn't a strike at all. Gurn came at him one last time, slower now, heat-drunk and staggering, more instinct than intention, and Rennick simply stepped aside on a leg that screamed at him for the effort and let his own exhausted body do the least dramatic thing imaginable. He dropped his full weight onto the man's back when he stumbled past and pinned an arm behind him, the way you'd restrain a combative patient in an ER bay at 2 in the morning. Nothing more sophisticated than basic hold technique, learned across 100 bad nights in 100 bad emergency rooms half a galaxy away from this ridge. "Yield," Rennick said quietly, close to Gurn's ear, both of them shaking now from exhaustion and blood loss and heat. "Or I let go and we both get up and do this again until one of us doesn't get up at all. I don't want that. I don't think you do either, not really, not once you've had time to think past the armor and the orders." For a long moment there was only the sound of Gurn's ragged breathing and the far-off thrum of guns that had, for the first time in weeks according to every soldier watching, gone completely silent because both sides were holding their breath at the stones. Then Gurn went still. He didn't speak the word. Instead, slowly, deliberately, in front of 600 Threnn soldiers and however many Korvax scouts were watching from the tree line, he turned his exposed throat upward, the single most vulnerable gesture a Korvax body could make, the place where every artery that mattered ran just beneath unarmored skin, and held it there, unmoving, in full view of the human kneeling over him, blood-streaked and shaking and refusing, even now, to look anything like a conqueror. Rennick let go of the arm. Gurn didn't move to retaliate. He simply lay there, throat bared, breathing hard, until the herald stepped forward from the tree line and pronounced, in that same flat voice, now carrying something that might almost have been awe, "The right is honored. The human champion stands. The terms bind both our peoples from this moment, witnessed and recorded." Rennick's victory should have ended the war for a season, and for about 6 hours it did. The Korvax withdrew from the valley in good order, as their law demanded of them, sullen columns of soldiers marching north under officers who would not meet the eyes of the Threnn they passed, and the settlement of Ilvara Hollow began, cautiously, hesitantly, to breathe for the first time in 6 months. It didn't last, because wars this old rarely end that cleanly, and the peace Rennick had bought with his own blood was about to prove exactly as fragile as everyone with real experience of Vessa Prime's war had feared it would be. The complication arrived with a Threnn courier at midday, half-collapsed from a hard ride across broken ground, carrying word that a third force, a Korvax faction loyal not to the honor-bound war-caste commanders who had extended and honored the right of attrition, but to a splinter warlord named Rennick Okoye, a Korvax who had never once recognized the right as binding on anyone beyond the two commanders foolish enough to invoke it, was already moving on the settlement from the north. With an artillery train, the 9th column had no remaining way to stop. Okoye's forces would arrive by nightfall. The courier gasped out between ragged breaths, hooves and treads both, more than the honor-bound army the 9th column had just faced and beaten. Okoye's guns alone, the courier said, could level the hollow in a single sustained barrage, honor right or no honor right, because warlords who don't recognize old law don't recognize the consequences of breaking it either. The right had bought the valley a season of peace from Gurn's people, from the commanders who still held to the old codes. It had bought nothing at all from a warlord who considered the right itself a relic for the weak-willed and the soft-hearted, and who had, as it turned out, been massing his own forces well outside the valley for exactly this contingency, in case the honor-bound commanders lost their nerve and settled for peace instead of conquest. Rennick, 3 cracked ribs, 1 stitched and heavily bandaged leg, both hands wrapped and throbbing, was lying flat on a cot in the triage tent with an IV line running fluid back into him when Vessa brought him the news, moving faster than Rennick had yet seen the commander move. "You have done what no one on this ridge believed possible," the Threnn commander said, all 4 eyes wide and fixed on him. "And it will not be enough. Okoye's guns will level this valley by dark unless something changes between now and then. We cannot evacuate 11,000 civilians in 6 hours across terrain this broken. We cannot fight a force that size with 600 exhausted, wounded soldiers and a champion who can barely stand." "Then we don't fight it," Rennick said, sitting up slow, jaw tight against the pull in his ribs, already reaching to pull the IV line free before anyone could stop him. "We stop it before it gets here. Get me everything you've got on Okoye's artillery. Everything. Schematics, supply manifests, intercepted transmissions, whatever your intelligence people have been sitting on. You are in no condition. I've operated on less sleep than this with worse wounds than this on people I didn't even know the names of yet," Rennick said, swinging his legs off the cot despite the pain that lanced up through the stitched thigh. "Get me the schematics, Vessa. We've got maybe 5 hours left to think of something, and I'd rather spend them thinking than lying here listening to a clock I can't stop." It was Gurn, still weak, still steam-scalded across the shoulders, and moving with the careful stiffness of a man who'd taken a beating he hadn't expected to survive, who found Rennick in the triage tent an hour later, not as an enemy anymore, but as something closer to an ally who understood, in the particular way only a soldier can, exactly what kind of debt he now owed and intended to pay in full. He'd brought a data slate stripped from a dead Korvax engineer captured during an earlier skirmish. Schematics for the artillery line Okoye's forces were even now dragging south along the only road on the entire continent wide enough to bear its weight. "I could not stand by," Gurn said, setting the slate down on the crate beside Rennick's cot without preamble. "You spared my life on those stones when the right gave you every right to end it. I do not know your customs. I know mine well enough to understand that I owe you a debt the right itself does not record, and I intend to pay it before this day ends one way or another." Rennick looked at the schematics for less than a minute before he saw it, his tired mind snapping into the same focused clarity it always found when a patient's life depended on the next 30 seconds of thinking. The guns ran on a pressurized coolant system, Korvax built, designed for a homeworld where ambient temperatures never dropped low enough at night to matter to anyone's engineering assumptions. Nobody who built that system had ever needed to think about what happened to pressurized coolant lines in the kind of hard, biting cold that settled over Vessa Prime's valley floor after sunset. A valley Rennick had spent 4 straight nights shivering through since he'd arrived, 4 nights during which nobody had thought to warn a newly arrived human that the temperature dropped nearly 40 degrees the second the sun went down behind the western ridge. "Your engineers never planned for this cold," Rennick said, tracing a finger along the schematic's coolant manifold, mind already 3 steps ahead. "These lines will overpressurize the second the ambient temp drops below freezing tonight, if the relief valves are still factory set for Korvax homeworld conditions, which they almost certainly are, because why would anyone rate cold weather tolerances into a system built for a species whose entire home range never sees frost? It's basic thermodynamics, cold air, denser gas molecules packed tighter together. Pressure builds faster than the seals were ever rated to bleed off safely. If somebody jams the primary relief valve on the lead gun in that convoy before dark, the whole manifold backs up behind it. You don't need to fight that artillery train, Vhestor. You need it to fail on its own, and the cold's going to do most of the work for us if we just give it the right push." "You propose sabotage," Vhestor said, arriving in the tent flap in time to catch the last of it. "I propose a maintenance visit," Rennick said. "I'm a medic. Not exactly a threatening job title, not to anyone who's spent the last 6 months fighting soldiers, tanks, and artillery crews. If I can get close enough to that convoy under a medical flag before it reaches the valley, I can jam that valve by hand in about 90 seconds. After that, physics does the rest, and physics doesn't care whose side it's on." "You cannot walk," Gurn said, gesturing at the bandaged leg. "Your wound." "Then somebody's going to have to help me cover the distance," Rennick said, and managed something close to a grin despite the ribs grinding with every breath. "You offering, or are you going to make me ask twice after everything I did for that throat of yours this morning?" Gurn's mandibles clicked in a gesture Rennick had learned by now was something like wry acknowledgement. "I am offering," he said. "It seems the debt is not yet paid in full." They went in at dusk, Renn, Gurn, and 2 Threnn scouts named Dissa and Coral, moving low along a drainage gully that ran parallel to the artillery road, while the temperature dropped fast enough that Rennick could see his own breath fogging thick by the time they reached the convoy's tail end. Every step on the wounded leg sent fire up through muscle he'd been told, in no uncertain terms by Urabel back at the tent, not to be using for at least another day. He used it anyway, leaning on Gurn's offered shoulder when the ground got too broken to manage alone, saying nothing about the pain because saying something wouldn't have changed it and would only have slowed them down. Asun's forces, arrogant in their numbers and confident in a victory they assumed was already decided, hadn't bothered posting more than a token watch on the rearmost gun in the column. Why would they, against 600 exhausted defenders with no armor to speak of, and as far as Asun's intelligence reports indicated, nothing left in reserve worth worrying about? A single Korvax loader stood near the tail gun's housing, running a lazy inspection more out of habit than vigilance. Rennick crossed the last 30 meters alone, on the leg that had been laid open that morning, moving like a man who had every right to be there, carrying his medkit like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, bungee cord and all. The loader glanced at him once and dismissed him instantly. An unarmed human medic, wandering near the guns with a battered case in hand, wasn't a threat any Korvax mind had ever been trained to register as a threat at all. Rennick even lifted the case slightly as he passed, the universal gesture of a medic on his way to tend someone, and the loader's attention slid right off him and back to whatever gauge he'd been squinting at. That was the whole trick in the end. Nobody had ever taught them to be afraid of something so small, and Rennick had spent his entire life being underestimated by people who should have known better. He found the relief valve exactly where the schematics said it would be, cold already under his fingers despite the gun housing's residual warmth, and jammed the tension bolt with a shard of the same rock he'd used against Gurn that morning. He'd kept it in his pocket without quite meaning to, the way you sometimes keep the thing that saved your life, wedging it deep enough into the mechanism that no amount of internal pressure would shift it without a full disassembly and the right tools, neither of which Asan's crew would have time to locate before the cold finished the job on its own. Then he turned around and walked back the way he'd come, at the same unhurried pace, medkit swinging loosely at his side, while his heart hammered hard enough to ache against his cracked ribs, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. He didn't run. Running gets noticed. Walking away slow, like you belong exactly where you are, gets ignored, and ignored was exactly what he needed to be for the next 30 meters. The line didn't fail immediately. It failed at full dark, 3 hours later, when the temperature bottomed out hard and fast the way it did every night on Vessa Prime, and the coolant pressure in that lead gun's line finally exceeded what a jammed valve could bleed off no matter how the internal system tried to compensate. And the resulting rupture didn't just disable one gun. It disabled the entire pressurized supply manifold feeding the 6 guns behind it, in a chain reaction blowout that lit the northern sky orange and sent Asan's entire artillery train grinding to a violent, chaotic halt, half its crews scrambling to survive a sudden coolant fire instead of marching on a settlement that, as of that moment, no longer had anything capable of leveling it before morning, or possibly for several days after, depending on how badly the manifold had been damaged. From the ridge, Rennick watched the distant orange bloom against the dark sky and let himself, for just a moment, sit down on an overturned crate and breathe without trying to think about the next thing that needed doing. "It worked," Dissa said beside him, something like disbelief in her voice. "Physics usually does, if you're patient enough to let it," Rennick said. "Doesn't mean we're done. Asan's still got infantry. Question is whether they've got the stomach to march on a settlement without their guns backing them up." Asan's remaining infantry, faced with a crippled artillery line, a valley they could no longer take before Threnn reinforcements arrived from the coast. Reinforcements that were, at that very moment, finally en route after weeks of council deliberation, finally broke in the 9th columns, favor once word of the right's outcome reached the wider war effort. And word spreading fast through Korvax ranks, the way word always spreads fastest about the thing nobody expected. That the Warcast's own honored champion had bared his throat to an unarmed human that same morning and lived to fight alongside him by evening, chose not to press the attack alone into ground that was no longer the sure thing Asan had promised them. By midnight, what remained of Asan's splinter force had withdrawn north in disarray, abandoning equipment they couldn't repair fast enough to matter. And by the time the sun came up gray and cold over the valley, the ground that had been an active war zone for 6 straight months had gone, for the first time anyone on that ridge could remember, completely and genuinely silent. No artillery thrum in the distance, no rifle fire echoing off the ridgeline. Nothing but wind moving through scorched trees, and the ordinary sounds of a camp waking up to a morning it hadn't expected to see. Rennick slept through most of that quiet, stitched and splinted and finally, blessedly horizontal, in a cot in the same triage tent he'd walked into less than 48 hours earlier as a stranger nobody had bothered to greet. He woke past midday to find Gurn kneeling at the foot of his cot, an enormous, steam-scarred 3-meter warrior folded down small in a canvas tent, built for beings a third his size, head bowed, throat once again bared in that same gesture of total submission he'd made on the stones that morning, and had apparently decided was owed a second time now that the debt had grown larger than a single duel. "I don't need you to do that," Rennick said, voice thick with sleep, pushing himself up on one elbow with a wince. "Seriously. Get up, you're blocking the light, and this tent's got about 6 other patients who need me to actually be able to see what I'm doing." "You ended a war in a single day that my people could not end in 6 months of open conflict," Gurn said, not moving, throat still bared. "You did it without killing me, without killing Asan, without spending a single Threnn or Korvax life more than the ones already lost before you arrived. My people do not have a word for what you did, human. We are still deciding what to call it, and until we have decided, this is the only tribute I know how to offer." "Call it overtime," Rennick said, easing himself fully upright, gritting his teeth against the ribs. "Because nobody's paying me extra for this, and I've got about 40 more patients in this tent who needed stitches an hour ago, so if you could get up off my floor and hand me that gauze roll on the crate behind you, that'd be a lot more useful to me right now than the kneeling. I promise you that much." Vhestor, standing in the tent flap with all 4 eyes open, made a sound Rennick hadn't heard from a Threnn before, something low and rolling, almost musical, that he'd later learn was the closest thing their physiology had to a genuine, unguarded laugh. "The human sphere sent us 1 medic," Vhestor said, "and told us it was all they could spare and meant it as an excuse. We took it as an insult. I do not think either of us understood what we were actually being given." "To be fair," Rennick said, reaching for the gauze himself since Gurn still hadn't moved, still hadn't lifted his throat from that bared, exposed angle. "They weren't entirely wrong about what they were spending. It was all they could spare in the sense that mattered to them. Turns out that was never really the problem. The problem was nobody back home ever asks what one stubborn person with a busted medkit and a bad set of ribs is actually capable of doing, before it's too late for anyone to keep underestimating them properly. You lot figured that out faster than most." He got the gauze. He got up, legs screaming, ribs grinding with every breath, and limped back to work, because there were still 40 patients who needed him, and the fact that the war was, against every reasonable expectation, actually over didn't change a single thing about the job in front of him. Gurn rose too, finally, and after a long moment standing there like he wasn't quite sure what to do with hands that had spent his whole life holding weapons instead of gauze rolls, picked up a stack of clean bandages and simply started handing them to Rennick, one at a time, without being asked twice. Word of what had happened on that ridge spread faster than any of them expected, faster even than the war itself had spread 6 months earlier. Within a week, Threnn Command had confirmed the coastal reinforcements would hold the valley through winter proper, no longer needed in the desperate, bleeding-edge way they'd been needed the day Rennick landed. Within 2 weeks, a formal Korvax delegation, not Asan's splinter faction, but the honor-bound war-caste command that had extended the original right, sent word requesting a permanent peace council be convened in the valley itself, on neutral ground, with both the human medic and his Korvax counterpart present as witnesses to whatever terms were finally struck. Rennick sat through most of that council, with his leg propped up on a crate, mostly silent, mostly there because Vhestor and Gurn both insisted his presence mattered more than his words, and mostly bored out of his mind by diplomatic language that took 4 hours to say what could have been said in 4 minutes. When a Threnn negotiator finally turned to him near the end and asked, with evident solemnity, what humanity would want in exchange for the intervention that had ended 6 months of grinding war in a single day, Rennick thought about it for a moment and said the only thing he could think of that felt honest. "Better supply crates," he said. "Ours keep expiring 3 weeks before anybody tells me, and maybe fix that latch on my case while you're drafting treaties, because I've been meaning to get it looked at for about a year and a half now, and it just never seems to be the priority." The negotiator, plainly expecting something grander, blinked all 4 eyes in what might have been confusion, until Vhestor made that low rolling sound again and explained, patiently, that this was simply how the human meant everything he said, plainly, without embellishment, and usually about something considerably smaller than the moment deserved. They fixed the latch. It took a Korvax field engineer all of 10 minutes, working with tools designed for artillery instead of medical cases, and when he handed it back, the hinge clicked shut clean and solid for the first time in over a year. Rennick turned it over in his hands, tested it twice, and felt, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, more moved by that small working latch than by anything said in the 4 hours of ceremony that came before it. 6 months later, long after the formal treaties had been signed, and the reinforcements from the coast had rotated the 9th column's exhausted survivors home for the rest they'd earned twice over, Rennick was still on Vessa Prime, not because anyone had ordered him to stay, but because Ilvara Hollow had asked, and because the small clinic they'd built at the edge of the settlement, half Threnn architecture and half whatever Rennick had insisted on for practicality, needed a medic who already knew everyone's names. Gurn visited most weeks, technically as a liaison for the new joint peacekeeping accord, though Rennick suspected the real reason was simpler than any title. He'd taken, with a seriousness that still occasionally made Rennick laugh out loud, to learning basic field medicine himself, on the theory, stated once, flatly, in that same clipped syntax he'd never fully lost, that a debt half paid in gauze rolls and gratitude was not a debt paid at all, and that the honorable course was to become useful in the same way Rennick had been useful, rather than simply grateful forever. "You're better at the sutures than you were a month ago," Rennick told him one evening, watching Gurn work through a practice kit on a training dummy with more patience than Rennick would have credited a war-cast soldier with possessing. "I have a good teacher," Gurn said, not looking up from the stitch he was tying off, "though he insists on calling every lesson overtime, which I have come to understand is a joke, though I am still determining precisely what makes it funny. It's funny because nobody's ever paid me a cent extra for any of it," Rennick said, "and at this point I've stopped expecting them to. Turns out that's fine. The work's the same either way." Outside the clinic, the valley that had burned for 6 months lay quiet under a Vessa Prime sunset, the ridge where it had all happened just visible on the horizon, grown over now with new growth pushing up through scorched ground the way it always eventually does. Somewhere in the settlement behind them, a child laughed at something, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely unafraid, and Rennick decided, not for the first time, that it was worth every cracked rib to have bought a sound that simple. If a story like this one made your day a little better, that's the whole reason it gets told, humans winning not through muscle, but through the kind of stubborn, sweat-soaked competence nobody in the galaxy ever sees coming. Hit like if Doc Okoye earned it, subscribe if you want more of humanity's unlikely champions, and drop a comment telling me what you think happens the first time Gurn tries to run his own triage line without Rennick standing over his shoulder. Share this one with somebody who needs a reminder that being underestimated is just an advantage nobody's told you about yet.